we will be ready to begin. So thank you everyone for attending. My name is Josh Weinberg. I am the Legal Training Manager here at the Policy Surveillance Program at the Center for Public Health Law Research, housed at Temple University Beasley School of Law. And this is part 3 of our advanced webinar series on the policy surveillance process. Today, we are going to be talking about collecting and building the law. So, might as well get started. How about that? So, the learning objectives for today. So today, we want to define what do we mean by collecting the law. When we talk about collecting the law within the policy surveillance process, what exactly do we mean? We want to learn the steps needed to be taken to collect and build the law. And then we're also going to discuss the quality control measures that exist within collecting and building the law. As you probably know, if you've been in any of our other presentations, quality control is very important to us, and of course it would be involved in this stage of the process. So let's put this stage of the process in context, shall we? So this is, again, you've seen this wheel before. We go back to it. This is the policy surveillance process. This is a general overview of the entire process. So now that we've defined our scope, we've conducted our background research, and we've developed our coding questions, you might assume that we'd be ready to code. But you've forgotten the most important step, which is actually collecting the law and creating the legal text so that you can answer the questions that you've developed. So that's the step that we're on now, and that's the step that's highlighted in on this circle that you're seeing on your screen. Again, the policy surveillance process is circular. It is not. It is a process that is iterative and is performed. That things can happen. So when we're collecting the law and creating legal text, you'll see there will be opportunities during this process to restructure some of our coding questions, add answer choices, redefine our scope. These are all things that will naturally happen as part of the collecting the law and creating the legal text process. But for the time being, this is the step in the process that we are at. All right, so collecting the law and creating the legal text. Here we have a new wheel to look at, and this wheel represents the full process of collecting the law. As you can see, this is, again, a process that is iterative, whereby this process is completed in batches of a few jurisdictions at a time. We generally recommend in a project where we're doing, generally in our state level projects, we're doing 51 jurisdictions total, 50 states plus the District of Columbia. So here what we do is do batches of 10 jurisdictions at a time. Doing it in this way simplifies quality control because issues with the project that we find throughout the collecting the law and creating a legal text process can be addressed early on before they affect too many jurisdictions. This allows us to collect the law more efficiently in the later jurisdictions in the project. Alternatively, if we just did all 51 jurisdictions at one time and we realize at the end, once we're later on in the process that we need to adjust our questions or add an answer choice, which would then impact our collection scheme and what exact laws that we're collecting, we would then have to go back and research every jurisdiction all over again. Doing it in 10 jurisdictions at a time allows us to deal with those issues as we come to them and make the process easier as we get to the later batches of jurisdictions. So just to go over this wheel quickly, the first thing that we do is identify the relevant laws. We record the citations on a master sheet. We collect the individual laws. We organize the laws into folders, and then we create the legal text. We are going to go over each of these steps in detail in the rest of our presentation today, so do not worry. So, collecting the law. We did say we would talk about the definition of collecting the law, so that's what do we mean by it? Collecting the law involves gathering important information on laws in each jurisdiction included in a project. these policies and laws are relevant to the topic being studied. Important information to collect in this process includes the citations for the legal text, the effective dates for the laws or policies, or i.e. the date when the law would begin to be enforced, and the statutory history at issue for each law in each jurisdiction. The goal of this is to collect important information about each law relevant to the topic being studied in each jurisdiction included in the project. The legal text is a term that you'll hear us use often here, and the legal text is the text of all the laws that are relevant to your project's topic in each jurisdiction. Each jurisdiction thereby has its own legal text or its own, basically the legal text is the universe of laws that you are worried about for each jurisdiction. The legal text is the outcome of collecting and building the law and is then used to code the law, which we'll be dealing with in our part 4 of this webinar series. As you collect the law, the search strategy should be refined and recorded. And it's also important to note that the process for collecting the law is the same for cross-sectional and longitudinal projects. Generally, there are a few differences that we're going to get to later. There's an additional document that we use in longitudinal projects, but we're going to get to that in a second. But again, important information to be collected in this process. Citations, we want to reference to every specific statute or regulation that we are collecting. We want the effective dates of each of those specific statutes or regulations, or the date when the law goes into force. That is the date that is most important to us in this process. We want the statutory history of each law, statute, or regulation, or what legislative session the law or amendment was enacted in, when that occurred. The legal text, this is again very important, meaning we want the actual language that's in the law. We don't want to just collect in the end the citations, we want the actual legal text that we can use to then answer our coding questions that we've developed. Each jurisdiction again has its own legal text. A word of caution before we move on to this process. This is our lawyerly note over here. Here at the policy surveillance process, the vast majority, if not all of us, happen to be lawyers, so of course we need to include a word of caution that users who are collecting laws should carefully review the terms of service from any databases, legal database or internet database or otherwise that they use. Most commercial legal databases, i.e. Lexis, Westlaw, the ones that we use here at our shop, impose contractual limits on users' rights to store and republish the laws obtained from that database. So in that case, we want to find what we refer to as an unencumbered source, or a source that is not encumbered with any copyright contractual limitations. Mostly, we find these sources on state legislative websites, but we also would advise that when you use state legislative websites, they typically have a section that indicates any applicable copyright restrictions. Sometimes they outsource their laws on there to Lexis and Westlaw, so be careful and keep an eye out for any copyright restrictions that you might find in the course of your search. But now we can move on to collecting the law. And we're now going to go into every stage of this circular process that we've discussed briefly. So the first thing that we're going to do is identify relevant laws, the first step in the process of collecting the law. So, identifying relevant laws. What this means is that we will use the search strategy established during the background research. So as we did our background research, as we wrote our memos, our policy memos, we developed a search strategy that we recorded in our research protocol. So now we're going to bring back that search strategy and use it to identify laws relevant to their topics in each jurisdiction in the current batch. Often, as I think we mentioned during the background research presentation, the sample of jurisdictions that you use to write your policy memo often is a great first batch to do in the course of your collecting the law. So likely if you did 2 full 5 jurisdiction policy memos, you'll have 10 jurisdictions that are already basically researched that you can use for this first batch. So you're going to use the search strategies that you established to write those memos, and now we're going to use those for those jurisdictions or other jurisdictions with whatever is in your current batch to identify the laws relevant to that topic in that jurisdiction. We then want to record the citations of relevant laws in a master sheet document. Here are a few tips, again, on search strategies, just so we bring those up again moving forward. Identify keywords by identifying common terms of art relevant to the project's topic in various jurisdictions. When multiple relevant laws are located in the same chapter, index, or table of content searches, then you can use supplemental keyword searches to use within those same chapters, index, or tables. Similarly, you can then go and look at the table of contents of each of those and see if there are any obvious titles of different sections of laws or policies that you need to collect. Additionally, remember that some jurisdictions may organize their law and structure it differently than others, so different search strategies may be needed for different jurisdictions. And then finally, remember to keep track of your search strategy and to memorialize it in the research protocol. So I just mentioned that what we want to do is identify the citations of relevant laws in a master sheet document. So let's go into what I mean by that, because that is the next step in the collecting the laws cycle, is recording citations on a master sheet. So, creating a master sheet. For each law, the master sheet should include the citation and title of that law, the statutory history of that specific law, and the effective dates of that specific law. A master sheet records all of the citations of laws that are in a project scope with one master sheet per jurisdiction. So you can see in this slide this is specifically Alaska's master sheet. So all of the relevant laws for a project for Alaska would be on Alaska's master sheet. It's important to keep this document as it keeps track of all of the laws being collected as well as key pieces of information on each of these laws. And then this master sheet then facilitates the rest of the research and coding process. As I just mentioned, one master sheet is created for each jurisdiction, and in each master sheet you record the citation, the statutory history, and the effective date of each law. The citation refers to a specific statute or regulation, including the title. The statutory history is the session law number for bills or the agency notice for regulation, and then this is included to identify the versions of the law included in the project. And then we want to include the effective date for each amendment, each specific statutory history entry. The effective date is the date the legislation becomes effective, not the passage date or the signature date. Remember as well. And then we have more resources on our website on Law Atlas on effective dates. So generally, laws are part of a hierarchy in which federal laws are at the top, local laws are at the bottom, and state laws or statutes are generally somewhere in between. We generally, on each master sheet, will layer the laws in hierarchical order, where federal laws are above state laws, above local laws, and statutes are above regulations as well. We also layer them in sequential order. Additionally, it's important to note that the statutory history and effective date information is doubly important in a longitudinal project. So on a cross-sectional project, it's really useful to collect this information, but in a longitudinal project, it's essential to collect this information. If a project is tracking laws over time, the researchers will need to collect the statutory histories and effective dates of the relevant laws going back to the start date for the project. You will notice that in this excerpt here, we only have one statutory history recording for each law, but if this was a project that was going back in time, we can see that there might be multiple amendments for each law, and we want to collect all of those going back to the start date of our project. Because the longitudinal project is one that tracks the evolution of laws over time, we're going to need to show how this law has changed over the course of time. So we're going to need to collect all the different versions of that law over the course of the project's timeline. Additionally, because of this, longitudinal project master sheets should be organized both hierarchically and chronologically. Each law's statutory history and effective date should be listed in chronological order under each title and citation, so that the legal text can be organized chronologically later in the process. I mentioned effective date, so here's a quick refresher. An effective date is the date that a law goes into effect and can be enforced. It is distinguished from the passage date, signature date, and date of approval. These are different steps in the legislative process and are not dates that are important to us. What's important to us is the date in which the law takes effect. And often these will be noted within the text of the law itself, or potentially it can be noted in the beginning of the chapter of the law where the subsection lives. Finally, they can also be noted in the beginning of the entire title book that houses all the laws passed in that legislative session. If you're not finding your effective date in any of these places, what you might need to look for is if your state, your jurisdiction, etc., has a specific rule surrounding effective dates. There are some states, for example, where every law that's passed in a certain legislative session goes into effect on the same date on the next year. So you will need to find those rules if the effective date is not obvious to you in the course of your research. As you can see in this example here, this is taken from Westlaw, where they often have the effective dates in this credit section. So if you were looking at this specific law in Westlaw, you would be able to see that the effective dates comes in this credit section that has the detail as to the specific amendment and its effective dates, as opposed to this is the effective date of the same law coming from a state legislative website, whereby it's referred to as the history of section, and there's no actual effective dates listed there, only the specific amendment citations. So there, in this situation, you would need to look at the session laws referenced in this history of the section to identify the effective dates if you were just going off of this sort of effective date information. So, going back to how we organize our master sheets, again, we organize citations hierarchically. As I mentioned, we sort the laws in the master sheet, organizing them by jurisdiction. Federal statutes go above federal regulations. By types of law, federal state statutes go above state regulations, go above local ordinance. And then finally, when we organize these things, we organize them by chapter and citation number. So a citation to 1255-135 will come before a citation to 1255-150. Organizing our citations in this fashion lets us collect the law in an organized manner, and then it makes the master sheet very useful for the rest of the project. The master sheet is a document that you'll be coming back to in future updates, especially if you need to see if any of the laws you've collected have been updated. It's also a document that you'll see when we go into longitudinal project details that'll be used to create our amendment trackers. And then additionally, master sheets are also used as a reference when you're actually building the law and coding the law. And then it's also important to remember when we talk about organizing citations hierarchically is that collecting the law generally may not be as simple as following one citation. Laws on a topic may sometimes come from different chapters. So to understand all of what the law says on a specific topic or issue requires connecting those pieces of the puzzle throughout different regulations, statutes, ordinances. Layering the law and compiling it into one master sheet document allows the legal universe for that jurisdiction to be navigated easily. The outcome of this process is the legal text that researchers will use to code answers to the questions that have been previously developed. So, once this research has been done, organized into master sheets. We usually have the supervisor check the original research. We want the supervisor reviewing for potential problems, such as just missing sections of the law. Are there sections of the law that are included in the table of contents that are not included in the master sheet? Proper citation format. If you're using Blue Book format, make sure that it's following all of those Blue Book rules. Using standard font and font size, and removing any notes that were included. So just organizing your master sheet document in a way so that it would be useful for people to use going forward. This is in addition to conducting spot checks on legal research engine to ensure that the researcher collected all relevant laws, comparing collected laws to an unencumbered source of law to ensure that they've been properly transcribed, and then verifying just generally that master sheets have effective dates and statutory history recorder for each law. This is original research checking that the supervisor can do throughout the course of the research. So you don't need to wait until the researcher is completely finished creating the master sheet to check on some of these things. This is stuff that can be done in the process of the original researcher's research. And I mention this because these are steps that can be taken that are different from the redundant research process, which is a built-in quality control measure that we do here at the Policy Surveillance Program and as part of Policy Surveillance to ensure the quality of the research being done for any policy surveillance process. And that's what we're going to talk about now. So what do I mean by redundant research? So redundant research is one of the quality control aspects inherent in collecting the law. It consists of two researchers independently identifying all of the relevant laws for a project in one jurisdiction. The goal of redundant research is to have two researchers independently research these jurisdictions and reach 100% agreement on the laws that must be collected for that jurisdiction. You can see that 2 is, there's a little asterisk next to 2 there on your screen. That's because while 2 is ideal, more than 2 researchers can be used and is encouraged if the area is complicated or highly regulated. And if you have the resources to do so, putting multiple researchers on sort of the redundant research process will just ensure that much more that you are collecting 100% of the legal universe that you need for your project. Generally, the way our redundant research process works is the supervisor reviews and compares the redundant research to identify whether the researchers diverged on the collected laws, and then 100% of jurisdictions are redundantly researched until the rate of divergence goes below 5%. Then 50% of jurisdictions are redundantly researched. If the rate remains then 20% of the remaining jurisdictions are redundantly researched, but if the rate of divergence goes above 5%, then we jump back up and do 100% of redundant research for the rest of the jurisdictions. So a quick overview, we're going to go into some more of the details of redundant research in the next couple of slides. So the goals of redundant research. When we conduct redundant research, what we're trying to do is develop and refine a research strategy, identify errors in original research, and ensure that all relevant law is identified as part of the collecting the law process. Early on in the research process, we assign this redundant research because it helps us develop this thorough search strategy. Having 2 researchers independently identify the relevant law for a single jurisdiction identifies both researchers' set of search terms, secondary sources that they've used to verify their research, and then any divergent chapters of the law that would need to be checked. Additionally, these divergences allow us to identify errors in the researcher. The truth is that even the most skilled researchers make mistakes. It's possible that someone didn't check the table of contents thoroughly enough, or they didn't collect the law mentioned in an internal reference. Maintaining this redundant research allows us to ensure that all of these errors are identified and remedied. And then finally, what this does is this then allows us to be confident that all the relevant laws that are included or excluded based on the scope of our project are collected. So this is an overview of the steps in redundant research. As you can see, there are 4 main steps to redundant research. Research assignments, as we said, we do most of our research in batches of 10 jurisdictions at a time. What that means is that we assign those 10 jurisdictions for research, and we assign those same 10 jurisdictions for redundant research. Redundant research is done throughout the project from beginning to the end. These two researchers will each complete their research. We will then compare and review their citations for divergences, and then resolve those divergences. So that first step, assigning redundant research. At the beginning of the project, when the team is identifying the methods that will be used to collect the law, the research should be done at 100% redundant rate for these first 10 jurisdictions, meaning that each researcher will research all the other researcher states. This is because we haven't clearly defined the methods for collecting the law, and the researchers themselves may be inexperienced with the body of law or the area of law, and the potential for error is high at that point. Once these methods have been clearly identified, including more clearly identifying a search strategy in your research protocol, the amount of redundant research may be reduced as described on this slide. If the area of the law is complex, or if certain states have unusual legal structures, or if there's a high rate of divergence, the supervisor should assign redundant research at their own discretion. Remember, these are suggestions we have here. This is what we do at the Policy Surveillance Program. If you're finding that this reduction in redundant research isn't working for you, feel free to do 100% redundant research throughout a project. In most of our projects here, we will very rarely not do 100% redundant research. We just find that our divergence rate, just because most of the projects we're working on are complicated or are in areas of the law which we don't have a ton of our own background in, we're going to be doing 100% redundant research on pretty much 100% of the jurisdictions in a project. It's most likely and is often because our rate of divergence just doesn't drop below 5%. So if you're not seeing that, don't be discouraged. It's common. It's a very common thing for the rate of divergence in the research phase to not drop as dramatically as it will, as you'll see, in the coding phase. So this assignment calculation is a suggestion and is what is the official policy of the policy surveillance process, but it's likely that you're going to be doing 100% redundant research throughout. But if you're curious, here is the formula for calculating the rate of divergence. The rate of divergence for research in a batch is used with this formula. It's the number of divergent laws over the total number of collected laws equals the divergence rate. If it is below 5% for your batch, you should feel free, if you're feeling comfortable, to drop your redundant research. So in this example, there were 4 divergent laws out of 100 total laws collected. So the result, that's a 4% divergence rate. We can then drop to about a 50% redundant research assignment for the next batch of jurisdictions. So this is a slide that sort of shows how the redundant research process works in terms of quality control. Each researcher is independently completing the research for either 5 or 10 or whatever the number of jurisdictions assigned. We have 5 in this title, but if you're doing an entirety of the first batch, it would be 10, for example. So in this example, let's say researcher A collected laws for Alabama, Arkansas, Alaska, Connecticut, and Ohio. Researcher B would collect those same states. Similarly, if researcher B collected their laws for a different group of 5 states, researcher A would then collect the laws in those states. They then independently record the citations, which then allow the supervisor to review, find the identical law, and the divergences. Which then leads to step 3. Supervisor compares and reviews citations of relevant laws. So in that example we just saw, the supervisor then gets basically 2 master sheets. We get a master sheet of the original research and a master sheet of the redundant research. This allows for easy comparison of citations of the laws. The supervisor can then look at them side by side, see that in this example, researcher 1 has an additional law cited as compared to researcher 2. And the supervisor can compare this and note this difference. This then allows us to go to the next step of resolving divergences. The team will then come together, discuss the divergences, determine why there's a divergence. Was it a simple error? Was it a misunderstanding of the scope of the project, of the question set? Was it a situation where we need to expand the scope of the project or expand the answer choices in a question set? And then we resolve the error by either deciding to include or exclude the law at issue. So in the case of researcher error, the supervisor will determine if it was an unusual legal structure in that jurisdiction. In that case, the research protocol can then be used to and revised to avoid missing laws in similar ways for future jurisdictions. This is an opportunity to adjust your search strategy. On the other hand, if the researcher just did not see a law, or if there's frequently missing laws in research, it might be a time where additional training on research techniques is needed for your researcher. And again, we want to update our search strategy in the research protocol as we go through this process of resolving divergences. Additionally, the scope of the project, which should be recorded in the research protocol, should also be updated at this point. Basically, any decisions you're making in the course of resolving your research divergences should be recorded in your research protocol. So finally, this is basically another version of the overview of the redundant research process. So this sort of sums it up for you. 2 researchers independently record citations of relevant laws on their master sheets for a jurisdiction. The supervisor compares and reviews these citations, finding the identical laws and the divergences. The divergences and the relevant laws are discussed by the supervisor and the researcher, so that we can finalize a final list of citations of all relevant laws for that jurisdiction. And that brings us to the end of that step of collecting the law. So now we have identified all the relevant laws and recorded these citations on a master sheet. And through the redundant research process, we have ensured that this has been done correctly and that we've identified all of the relevant laws for a jurisdiction in the master sheet. Situation where we're doing this with batches of 10 jurisdictions at a time, at the end of, at this point in the process, we will have 10 final master sheets, so 1 for each jurisdiction. So now we're ready to move on to the next part of the process, or collecting individual laws based on the master sheets. So now that we have all of the relevant citations in our master sheets, we're ready to collect the text or the body of the law. To do this, it's relatively straightforward. We use each citation to look up the body of the law and store the actual legal text or the language in a document. You can see in this example, in our shop, we often use a word processor like Microsoft Word is the most obvious one, but if you have your own preferences for that, feel free to use it at any sort of word processor that you have on your computer. The idea here is that you have 1 document per relevant law in each jurisdiction. So we do this because it's possible or probable that the law has to be collected from different sources. So the process of copying the text and putting it into a document in this way ensures that all relevant laws are collected and are in one place before before we begin coding. This will speed up the coding process and creates a reference material that can be useful for quality control. Again, I want to bring up our disclaimer at the beginning that you should be taking this language of these legal texts from an unencumbered source. So that step in this process was a pretty basic one. It allows us to collect the individual laws, and then now what we do is take those individual laws that are collected into separate documents on our computer and organize those into folders in our computer. So what we mean by that is this visual here. So basically, each jurisdiction should have its own folder that contains documents relevant to that jurisdiction. So we have in the Alaska folder, for example, there'll be, so in a 51 jurisdiction survey, 50 states plus DC, there will be 51 total folders. Each folder will contain that jurisdiction's master sheet, all of the collected laws, and then the amendment tracker, which is a document that we'll get to in a bit, which is specific for longitudinal projects. Keeping documents organized by jurisdiction will make it easier to prepare for coding and building the law, and will allow the supervisor to perform quality control more efficiently. We'll discuss amendment trackers and legal text in the next slide. So for now, just know that organizing the laws into folders and organizing them hierarchically in these folders will allow us will facilitate the next steps in the process. So now, once we organize our laws into documents, organize them into folders, we're now ready for the final step in collecting the law, which is creating the legal text. But what do we mean by creating the legal text? What we mean is creating the legal text, which is defined here, the organized version of the relevant law for a jurisdiction. For cross-sectional purposes and for cross-sectional projects, this is a relatively simple step. There is one legal text for each jurisdiction, as we are only looking at one single point of time. For longitudinal projects, it becomes slightly more complicated, as there are multiple legal texts for each jurisdiction, as we are collecting the legal text for the one jurisdiction over a period of time. The amendment tracker is a document that helps us in this process of going from master sheet to longitudinal legal text, and we're going to discuss that. The legal text is the document, or is the final document that is used to code the law. The legal text is the universe that we use to code the law based on the questions that we've developed in our previous question development step. So let's talk about the basic version of this, the cross-sectional project. So this example demonstrates how we use the master sheet to create the legal text for a cross-sectional project, to show the law as it exists at a single point of time. So this example is taken from a project on distracted driving laws, and here we can see a brief sampling of the Alaska master sheet for that project. So here we have our final version of our master sheet, which lists all relevant laws in one jurisdiction, here being Alaska, along with the effective dates and the statutory history. For a cross-sectional project, the researcher will copy the body of the law for the most recent citation in effect prior to your project's cross-sectional date. So here, for example, this example uses July 1st, 2012 as the cross-sectional date for this project. So what we want to do is the researcher would include the versions of the laws in this iteration containing the legal text for Alaska 1255.035 as it existed effective July 1st, 2012, 2801.010 as it existed effective July 1st, 2010, and 2835.161 as it existed effective May 11, 2012. Collecting all of the versions of this law will create the one version of the legal text for Alaska as the law existed on July 1st, 2012. And then this one legal text can then be used to answer the questions that we created, or code the law, as we refer to it, with the questions we've developed previously. So that is, at its most basic, collecting and creating the legal text for a cross-sectional project. Basically, you use the master sheet citations that you've collected to collect the full legal text for that one jurisdiction for the date that you are interested in looking at cross-sectionally. Things become a little more complicated for a longitudinal project, and that's where the amendment tracker comes in. So the amendment tracker is a document that shows the progression of the laws in a specific jurisdiction. Amendment trackers list amendments to relevant laws in one jurisdiction in a chronological order. You will have one amendment tracker for every jurisdiction in a project, similarly to how you will have one master sheet for every jurisdiction in a longitudinal project. The amendment tracker includes the effective dates for each amendment and descriptions of changes made in each amendment. Each entry into the amendment tracker reflects one version of the law that must be collected, built, and coded in order to measure the law across the time period included in the project. The next slide includes a sample of an amendment tracker used in a distracted driving law dataset. Get a feel for longitudinal building before spending too much time here. I would say if you're planning on building a longitudinal project, you should pay attention, but remember that's a decision that gets made in the first scoping step. It might not be relevant to you, but it might be relevant later because as you'll see, longitudinal projects are often very easily created from cross-sectional projects. So, again, just as a reminder, the amendment tracker serves as a guide when creating a legal text for a longitudinal project and updating a cross-sectional project. So this is an example of how the master sheet and the amendment tracker are used together to create longitudinal data. So here is a similar example to what we discussed before, Alaska distracted driving data set. But here, this is a longitudinal project. So we care about each time each of these laws in our master sheet was amended. So as we can see here, refined citations are recorded in this master sheet, where all relevant laws in Alaska's jurisdiction are recorded along with each of their amendments and effective dates for each of these laws. The researchers will then use the master sheet to create the amendment tracker, which adds an iteration for each date the law changes. Remember that the amendment tracker describes the change that occurred on that date. Sometimes these are big changes, and sometimes they are minor changes. So sometimes the whole law can be repealed. Sometimes a third sentence or a period is deleted. We want to track all of these changes no matter what. No matter what is happening to the law at issue in our universe, we want to track what has changed. The researcher will then copy the body of the law for every citation in effect on the date listed for that iteration in hierarchical order and paste it into the legal text. So, for example, this is the legal text for May 11, 2012, and the researcher will then include the versions of the law of 12/30/55/035, which, as it existed from September 2010, 2801/010, which as it existed in July 1st, 2010, and then 2835/161 as it was amended effective May 11th, 2012. There's going to be one version of the legal text for every iteration included in the amendment tracker. So in this example here, there would be 3 legal texts for Alaska. How the law looks on January 1st, 2011, which would be the start date of the project, for example. How the law looks on May 11, 2012, and then finally how the law looked on July 1st, 2012, when that third amendment came into effect in 12/55/035. So this slide shows then how you create the next version of amendment from the May 11, 2012 version to the July 1st, 2012 version. Please note in this example, we do not contain the full text, so the details of the changes aren't readily apparent, but the changes in the titles are clear. So using our amendment tracker, we know that 12/55/035 was amended effective July 1st, 2012, after it had been already in effect as of September 26, 2010. So to create the July 1st, 2012 legal text, we're going to follow these steps. We're going to use the amendment tracker to confirm the changes in the law. We're going to open the previous version of the legal text, in this case, May 11, 2012, save as or otherwise duplicate the entire document, find the specific law that has changed. Here it would be 1255.035. Make the edits as necessary to that law, and then save the new version of the legal text as the July 1st, 2012 version of the law. In this way, there will be one legal text from July 1st, 2012, and one legal text from May 11, 2012, even though they're nearly identical. All that will have changed is the amendment that occurred in that first law on July 1st, 2012, even if it's a very minor detail. So what we're going to do now is you had in your in the page that you saw when you first entered this course, a document for Exercise 1, Amendment Tracker. What that exercise is the creation of an amendment tracker for Virginia from January 1st, 2009 to July 2016 based on the provided laws. So in that document, you want to use the provided laws here and to fill out the amendment tracker that we've given to you. Write a description of the changes made to the Virginia laws in the blank portion of the amendment tracker for each iteration, and then look to see if any of them would change the legal text and whether those are substantive. And then I'll show you the amendment tracker as it's our version of the amendment tracker so you can compare. So I would say what time is it? We only have, so take 5 minutes to take a look at this, and then we'll spend a good amount of time going over, the last 5 minutes going over the answers, or basically how this amendment tracker should look. And if you have any questions about that, feel free to contact us on the chat page. So here is the our version of the amendment tracker from the exercise for your review. As you can see, there are 4 iterations, and this project began on January 1st, 2009. But at that point, in Virginia, there were no TBI-specific laws yet. So in this situation, we would have sort of a blank iteration showing that there is no youth TBI law, because the fact that there is a data point itself. July 1st, 2010 would be iteration 2. I'm sorry that these say iteration 1. That's a mistake. July 1st, 2010 would be the first iteration of the youth TBI law. It's enacted that date. It's then on July 1st, 2014 would be iteration 3. So then in that situation, there are 2 more. There is what the existing law is amended to scope in non-interscholastic youth sports programs utilizing public school property, which in our case is non-substantive. So what that means for us is when we use the phrase non-substantive, we're referring to changes to the law that don't impact our coding. So while we will need to make whatever changes that occur in the legal text so that we actually can accurately reflect the legal universe, it's not going to impact any of our coding, and therefore we refer to it as non-substantive. That's as opposed to the addition of the new law, 271.6, which is enacted on the same date, which adds a return to learn protocol, which in just an aside in youth TBI means that there are now rules surrounding when the student can go back to the classroom. And then you'll note that so this is what we refer to as a substantive change because it impacts coding. The July 1st, 2016 amendment, which would then in this actual situation should be iteration 4, both of these laws were amended, but they were both amended non-substantively. So the language has been changed. So for example, student athlete has been changed to just student in this language. So these are changes that we're going to need to collect and reflect in new versions of the legal text, but because it doesn't impact any of our coding, we refer to it as non-substantive, and none of our actual coding answers or choices will change in that situation. And we'll get into more details on coding in our next presentation, which is specifically on coding the law. So, but this one has been about collecting the law. So let's talk about, in summary, what happened today. So in summary, prior to collecting the law, we want to refine citations collected in the policy memo based on the current scope of the project. This is a good first step in collecting the law because usually that first batch is based on the jurisdictions assigned in the policy memo, and our search strategy will be based on that as well. Collecting the law itself consists of researchers finding and gathering important information about laws relative to a topic in each jurisdiction being studied. We do our collecting the law redundantly is a important aspect of our quality control and to ensure that we've collected all of the relevant laws, meaning that 2 researchers will independently research a single jurisdiction and go through the steps required to collect and build the law individually so that we can compare the results and find divergences. And those steps that required in collecting and building the law are identifying the relevant laws, 2, creating a master sheet, 3, collecting individual laws using citations on the master sheet. This would be the time where the redundant research comes in and these master sheets are compared by the supervisor. And final master sheets are, based on the discussion of divergences, are finalized. We then organize the law into folders and then transfer and combine the collected laws into legal text documents. Again, in a cross-sectional project, there's 1 master sheet for each jurisdiction and 1 legal text document for each jurisdiction. In a policy surveillance or longitudinal project, we will also create an amendment tracker. And then the amendment tracker is then used to create one version of the legal text per change in the law over time. So what that means is that in a longitudinal project, there's one master sheet for each jurisdiction still. There's one amendment tracker for each jurisdiction still, but there are multiple legal text documents, with each legal text document representing one version of the legal text as it existed at each point in time as it's amended through the course of the time frame of the project. So hopefully that's all clear to everyone. If anyone has any questions on that and on the process of collecting and building the creating the legal text, please let us know now in this chat box or in the Q&A feature on here. Additionally, please keep in touch. Send us an email, call us, tweet at us, visit our website. Our website, lawatlas.org, if you aren't in the know, houses all of our existing legal databases. So all of our existing cross-sectional longitudinal projects are there, including our research protocols, data, and other publication documents. We also have a learning library with some more details on some of these steps included in there. I will be sending out a recording of this presentation as soon as it is ready. And then please also join us for the next iteration of the webinar, step 4 in the process, which is the fun part, I would say, which is coding the law using the collected law and the legal text along with our coding questions to answer those questions. That will be in 3 weeks on Tuesday the 29th at 11 a.m. Please join us then. Otherwise, be in touch and let us know if you have any questions. And thank you for joining us with us today. Have a great rest of your Tuesday. Thank you.